Good evening, afternoon, or whatever other time it may be, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard Titanic. What you're looking at is the latest program from the good folks at Vintage Digital Revival, an LLC dedicated to recreating the entirety of RMS Titanic to unprecedented virtual detail. This particular program I'm running now is a demo of a subsidiary project of theirs called Project 401, which is a culmination of over a decade of research, modeling, texture work, and all the other necessary things to build a 3D environment like this. So named for Titanic's hull number at Harland & Wolff Shipbuilding in Belfast, the completed 401 will be available on Steam and include improved sound design, various historical features, and added gameplay elements to make the environment a more flushed-out experience. This is, of course, not VDR's primary program, which remains Titanic Honor and Glory. Ongoing development is progressing toward producing 100% of Titanic to a level never before accomplished in any medium, digital or physical, including the set for the Cameron film, which, while detailed, was not quite this square footage. The flagship project will inevitably include a more classically structured video game level of playability. This information, other questions answered, images, links to videos, and other downloads, including this one, can be found at www.titanichg.com. I apologize if my microphone is somewhat low quality sounding. That's because it is indeed very low quality. There is probably fan noise in the background. The relatively new Unreal Engine 5, in which this program is running, does make computers run a little warm, so there will be fans running in the background to make sure that I don't melt my GPU. The reason I'm speaking to you today, and I assume someone is listening, despite the fact that I've never uploaded anything anywhere ever before, is to give what I hope to be an informative tour of approximately 50% of Titanic's floor space, to the best of my ability. I think it's probably best to separate this tour into multiple videos by class, otherwise it would take a few hours to accomplish this, so I think we'll break it up sort of at the officers' quarters, then general crew spaces, and then move from third class to second and finish with first. So I suppose we'll get right into it. We are standing now on the ship's bridge, the navigating bridge, which is the primary, at least when we're approaching or shortly after departing a port, control center for the ship. There is a helm and engine telegraphs here. We are sitting a little under 200 feet from the ship's bow, which allows for some sense of scale here, that we're about 200 feet from the front of the ship. And again, this platform would be predominantly used not while at sea, but sort of in close maneuvering in the vicinity of a shoreline. And this is at least in part because of these open bridge wings on either side of the ship here. The entire structure, with the exception of this forward bulwark, is made of wood. So most of this is entirely gone from the wreck on the sea bottom. The only thing that remains is this brass telemotor here. The helm itself is gone, but the mechanism remains. But these bridge wings allowed for a very suitable, not quite 360-degree view for the officers when maneuvering the ship, forward and aft and down across the ship's side. Look aft there. These engine telegraphs are for communicating with the engine room, communicating orders with the engine room. How these worked, since ships of the era didn't really have throttles in the conventional sense that we would imagine today, the officers would move this indicator lever to whichever command they wanted, be it a head full or a full astern or all stop, and then an identical piece of equipment down on the engine room control platform would ring that command. The engineers would then acknowledge it, and then they would have to actually make the engines execute that order and manipulate the engines to do what the officers wanted. There wasn't a direct throttle lever like you would see on a modern ship. You can see here we have an inclinometer, which indicates how much we're listing. We're on an even keel at the moment, which is good. There are, on this outer bridge here, storm shutters that can be placed over these windows in rough seas, which would make this entire space somewhat more livable in the event that the windows were to blow out as the crest breaks over the bow. Here we have the ship's, or one of the ship's binnacles, compass, that would be inside here. The hatch, or not hatch, but little cover is up over it at the moment. This can fold down. The binnacles are back illuminated at night, and you want to maintain acclimation for night vision, because night vision does take quite some time to acquire, and it can be lost in a moment with any exposure to light. So there were multiple precautions taken throughout the forward part of the ship to prevent exposure to light for those on watch, and indeed there was no illumination forward of the bridge. All of those portholes and hatch covers and everything, those were all covered up so that there wasn't any light bleeding back towards the bridge here. And here is the wheelhouse, which was used on a more day-to-day basis. There's another helm here, but there's covers over these windows as well, so that the lights that might be on in here during the nighttime portions of the crossing wouldn't be filtering forward to someone on watch here on the bridge. And this also applies to lights placed around the deck house, the officer's deck house here. They have cowlings to prevent light from filtering forward and messing with people's ability to see things, because you generally want that to be at its best for anyone standing here on the bridge wing or up there in the crow's nest, which we will get to. I don't know precisely at what point in the tour. Sometime during the cruise spaces, we'll go up there to the crow's nest and take a look at what there is to see from up there. In here, in the wheelhouse, this is the primary helm that would have been in use for most of the crossing. The forward one actually isn't connected to the steering gear. It's only connected to this helm. This one does directly change the condition of the rudder. And indeed, the forward helm on the bridge can be entirely disconnected from the steering gear, or at least from this helm and its connection to the steering gear. Because this brass telemotor, I misspoke earlier. There's nothing forward on the bridge that remains recognizable. This brass telemotor and its connection to the steering gear is what remains. There is a cluster of plaques left by various expeditions to the wreck around this point. This entire wooden structure, the binnacle and the helm and everything around it, those are all long gone. But the brass telemotor here, that does remain intact. These cabinets hold semaphore flags for communicating with other ships. You could rig flags with various messages on them, probably to one of these lines here that come down from the foremast. Those would only really be useful during the day, though, but there was a visual Morse communication system on board. These lamps on top of the bridge wing tabs, those you can blink in Morse code, port or starboard side, and those function as another way to visually communicate with passing ships. They did attempt to use these to communicate with a light on the horizon during the sinking that we now believe was the SS Californian. Probably. There's still debate, but it was probably the Californian. In the event of a power outage up here and the running lights go out, they had oil lamps they could rig as a precaution, just so that there was some visual indication that there was a ship here, which you generally want, especially if you're in the vicinity of the shipping lanes or a busy part of the shipping lanes. You want, even if you're dead on the water, to be seen by an approaching vessel so that you don't have a collision. Also here in the wheelhouse are the termination point of the telephone circuits. These can communicate with various other parts of the ship, predominantly the crow's nest, the engine rooms. I think there's some in the boiler rooms, places like that. We have a barometer here. It's fair weather, and the thermometer indicates it's about 55 degrees, so it is a gorgeous day out. You can see it's a sunny day, Some fluffy clouds going on. A little bit of a breeze, but nothing much. It's a nice day. Kind of crisp, but lovely. There's also deck plans here for ease of navigation. And they've posted throughout this map some of these colored plans with colorations to indicate precisely what is available and what isn't. Darker pink, I believe, is directly explorable, and then lighter pink is merely visual. You can see it, but you can't actually walk there. So as you can see, that's a significant percentage of the ship, roughly half. The areas that are not directly included are generally cabins or repetitive machinery spaces, so things that are somewhat redundant at this stage. Eventually, especially with Titanic Honor and Glory, the project after 401, 100% of the ship will be available, and you'll be able to manipulate things to a much greater extent than in this predominantly static environment here. Behind these doors are a handful of spaces. There's the navigating room through this door, which essentially functions as a captain's office, and then his stateroom, which is further aft through that space, is a three-part room. There's his bedroom further forward, then his sitting room, and then an ensuite bathroom furthest aft. And that's all connected directly to the navigating room, and he can therefore have access to the bridge from his bed in under a couple of seconds, essentially. There was a harbor pilot that was brought on board when they were approaching or departing a harbor to help the ship navigate that particular harbor. Perhaps Titanic is entering a harbor that she rarely did. So most large ships of any purpose or type have a harbor pilot brought aboard to do the navigating for them, if the officers are less familiar. And sometimes that harbor pilot, if they have to heave to for a storm, would need to stay on board for longer periods of time, so he was fitted with his own cabin, and that was right here, off the wheelhouse. Like we have a ship's log there on the counter. We can move outside here to the officers' promenade, which is notable for the location of some of the first lifeboats that we can see here. There are 4 lifeboats here, 2 of which are collapsibles. There's one right here, and then one up on top of the roof of the officers' quarters. These, unlike the standard wooden-sided boats here, you would need to fold up these canvas sides. There's some assembly required for these lifeboats. They're essentially rafts in their current state. And during the sinking, they got nearly all of the lifeboats away in the conventional sense, using these Welland davits here, hooking the lifeboats up, lowering them down to the water, or down to deck level, filling them and lowering them down to the water. But these collapsibles, I think this one may have got away, but the 2 up on the roof of the officers' quarters, they had to get them down, and they used ramps made of oars, and they sort of rolled them or slid them off the roof, and it didn't work the greatest. Both of those collapsibles up on the roof, they were washed off the ship. They did not have time to set them up on the davits and lower them in the conventional sense. So there's some evidence that they may, with additional lifeboats, have run out of time to launch the ones, even the number they had, because additional boats may have gotten in the way. We can never know, but since they ran out of time with the men and boats they had available, they may have ended up losing more lives than we did in reality. You can see all of the funnels up there. They are venting smoke. At least some of the boilers are lit. Moving aft here, we can head into the officers' quarters deck house. And I want to bring your attention to this poster here, which is done in the style of a White Star advertising poster, but it is actually a poster for this project. You can pause the video and do some reading there. They've got some further information about what will eventually be included, perhaps a timeline there, and then at the bottom there's some information about where you can go to find more information. This is, I should specify here before we get too far, this is a free download. If you have a system with approximately 16 gigabytes of RAM, you should be able to run this on the highest settings, in theory. Well, as long as you don't have an integrated graphics card. But for the most part, if you have a relatively beefy instrument to run things on, this should function quite well. It's very, very heavily optimized compared to earlier versions, so it runs very smoothly. So, along this corridor are various officers' cabins. Here, the slightly larger cabin, is the Chief Officer, Henry Wilde, First Officer William Murdoch, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Third Officer Herbert Pittman, and then it skips to the Fifth Officer, Lowe, and the Sixth Officer, Moody, on this side. These two cabins here. And that's, I believe, stewards were bunked in there. The Fourth Officer, Boxhall, was bunked over here on the other side of the ship, and I don't know precisely why that was done. He's over here with Captain Smith. This door here is this would be Boxhall's cabin. This door leads to the officer's smoke room, which we can't go in, but it would be behind that door. These doors are open now, and I can't emphasize enough how satisfying it is to have this door between the exterior promenade and the officer's deckhouse open. It's hard to describe. Moving on. Here is an expansion joint in the floor here. These are necessary, because if the ship is spanning multiple swells in high seas, you don't want a completely rigid structure, because that will put undue stress on that structure and she could split. And that would be bad. There's a wooden ship, the Wyoming. I believe it was a 450-foot schooner, an American schooner, a wooden ship that broke up in heavy seas. We think, anyway. We don't know precisely how she sank. Whoops. But she sank with all hands, and in all likelihood it was a structural problem. So you want elements like this to allow a ship to flex over multiple crests to ensure some form of structural stability. It's kind of an oxymoron, because you would think that if something's bending, that's bad, but no, this was intentional flexing. Through that door, you can see the notification. That's first class. We won't go in there quite yet, but we'll definitely get there. Through here is the Marconi office. The Marconi operators were in here. This would have been their office, and next door was their cabin. As you can see, we have their operators' equipment here, the keys that they would use to actually type out their message, some cards to read out cards for incoming or outgoing messages. There's the headset there. Other various equipment in here. Appears to be a telephone. These are pneumatic tubes, so you could roll up a message in one of those little teeny tiny capsules there, and it could be sent under air pressure to, I think, the first and second class purser's office, and then perhaps a couple of other locations throughout the ship. There appears to be a third one there. I don't know precisely where it would go. A calendar there set to April. Both of these clocks are set to my system time at the moment, but in actuality, one of them would be set to Greenwich Mean Time and the other Eastern Daylight. So, port of origin, port of destination. But for the moment, all clocks on board, and you can hear them ticking, perhaps. I can. I assume you can. They all do function. Through this door here is the actual wireless equipment. These are giant batteries here, and the little dials, with the brass dots down there, the circles with the brass dots, those allow you to manipulate the voltage moving into the equipment so that you can either intensify or de-intensify your spark, both ingoing and outgoing. And then we have this giant switch here. Those are the on-off switches for the equipment, and there's some readouts to monitor things, how things are going. I believe that's static reduction sand, but I could be wrong there. But this equipment needed to be repaired during the crossing, and Marconi, the manufacturer, the operators were not actually crew members of the ship. They were Marconi employees, and they were told that if something were to break, not to try to fix it, to wait until they got into port and a Marconi technician would come aboard and work on the equipment. But this entire set went down partway through Titanic's maiden voyage, and Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two operators stationed aboard Titanic, pulled out the equipment and fixed it themselves. They worked through the night, I believe the night of the 13th of April, to fix the equipment, and it's a good thing they did, because they definitely would be needing this equipment the next night. Titanic was fitted with some of the highest quality telegraphy equipment at sea at the time. I believe the only set that was even remotely equivalent in power was that aboard Olympic, and Titanic's was improved and rearranged from Olympic's configuration, so she was more than capable of talking to multiple land stations, at least until the early hours of the morning on April 15th, when her power began to fail. So this is the cabin that the operators would sleep in. As you can see, they have a wardrobe, 2 bunks, couch. There's a skylight that passes over between both the office and the cabin here, and then there's a door to separate the two spaces. This is actually a wash basin. You just can't see it because the wash basin itself folds up. That little brass knob there, you could pull that drawer down and there's a teeny tiny little porcelain wash basin that folds up to conserve space, but there's also a set of drawers down there, a mirror with a little shelf, more drawers underneath all of the rest of the furniture as well. Nice coat hook there. Steam heating throughout the ship as well. But that is sort of an introduction to the officer's deckhouse aboard Titanic in Project 401, or Demo 401. There will be, I believe, 4 more parts to this tour. Crew spaces, and then each of the passenger classes. There may be some overlap because we have to pass through spaces multiple times to give different parts of the tour, but we'll at least try to see most of the interesting spaces. As you can see, the skybox and ocean textures and rendering quality and the lighting are all heavily improved, and that's at least mostly due to the upgrade to Unreal Engine 5. It's all very quite pleasing to look at. But I want to thank everybody who may be tuning in for watching, and we will see you all in the next part of the tour, which I believe will be the crew spaces forward. So, thank you very much.